How's it going, y'all? Rafa the Pickleball Tech Dude here, and today's full review is going to be a little bit different. Never before have we seen a company undergo so many iterations of the same paddle or the same technology due to one particular issue. The JOOLA Pro 4 Perseus models launched today, and Pro 4 is a very apt name considering this is the fourth iteration of this paddle that JOOLA is releasing in order to not only obtain the trademark characteristics of their popularized Gen 3 tech, but also remain in spec to governing body guidelines, which has been a very big issue for JOOLA over the past year due to one issue in particular, and that's durability. So due to this unique position JOOLA has found themselves in, this review is going to be a little bit different in that we're going to start off with a few minutes on the on-paper specs, as well as the power, the control from a shot accuracy perspective, and the overall ball feel for this paddle, which I will compare to several industry competitors. And then we'll launch into a few minutes on an extensive durability test that I performed in order to see whether or not JOOLA has really buttoned up these issues. And of course, we'll wrap up with my overall recommendations for who buys these paddles, if any, and which of the four between the Perseus and Agassi Pro models, which also launched today, performed the best in my opinion. And spoiler alert, I will be taking one of these paddles to the Texas Open to compete, and I do have a very strong preference for one core thickness over the other. So let's dive in. Here's your close look at the Perseus Pro 4 and Agassi Pro paddles. They'll launch today at $280, and just as JOOLA's previous launch, this is a no discount code situation for the first 2 months. However, if you do choose to use my affiliate link in the description, it goes a very long way to helping out the channel. But per usual, there is no compensation or obligation for me to do this review whatsoever, and I would wait until the end of the video when you have my full thoughts before making your decision. Here's the stats overview for all the paddles one by one, and I want to call your attention to a couple of trends in particular. Firstly, the vast majority of these stats are completely average. When it comes to spin numbers, these paddles do break 2,000 RPM, but that's practically an expectation, especially for Gen 3 paddles nowadays. The twist weights are good for elongated paddles, but not overly impressive. The only areas where we really see strong numbers are per usual in the power and pop categories. The only other thing that may have caught your attention is that the 60mm paddles do hit harder than the 14mm. JOOLA has brought back their propulsion core tech from their Gen 3 series, which I'll talk more about in a moment, and I've talked about this phenomenon in the past, but essentially any paddle with this diving board style construction to their Gen 3 paddles can be thought of like a rubber band. The further you stretch the rubber band back, the harder it snaps back. So, with the 60mm paddles, simply having more room for the core to displace into upon ball impact, it gives the ball back more energy. I do also want to point out that from a stats perspective, the Pro 4 Perseus is very similar to the Gen 3S, with the one exception being somewhat significantly less spin. I can't draw the same comparison for the Agassi Pro, of course, because there was no Agassi Pro Gen 3S. To briefly cover construction, a lot of this is going to sound very familiar. These paddles are Gen 3 polypropylene core-based paddles with edge foam injections going all the way down through the handle, as well as an innermost channel of more flexible foam in the upper hemisphere of the head. The two primary construction differences to pay attention to here are firstly, non-compressed cores are here to stay. In the original Gen 3 and mod versions, JOOLA was compressing their cores into the proper thicknesses during the thermoforming process. And while this did lead to an exponential gain in power as they broke in, it also led to many durability issues, which is why they were removed during the Gen 3S production, and they will continue to be removed during the Pro 4 production. And the second feature to pay attention to is the introduction of TechFlex power. This is two areas in roughly the 5 and 7 o'clock positions in the paddle head of more dense, more yellow appearing foam than the propulsion core, meant to improve the ball feel and forgiveness of the sweet spot in the throat area. And the shape of that foam kind of reminds me of a normal distribution for my statisticians watching. All right, let's talk the juicy stuff. What does this paddle feel like on the court? And we'll start with the power side. The Pro 4s and Agassi Pros are definitely still power paddles, and fairly strong ones at that. The 60mm hover right around the top 10% of paddles I've hit in terms of power, with the 14mm lagging not too far behind. And this should be very familiar territory for those of you who are comfortable with the Gearbox Pro Ultimate elongated 16mm, the 11624 Power Series, or the Paddletech Bantam TKOC 12.7s. However, when it comes to control from a ball accuracy perspective, this is really where things become a tale of two core thicknesses. The 16mm Pro 4 and Agassi Pros both feel like they have an increased dwell time that allows you to keep hard shots inside the court, but in general, and especially at the net, there is a feeling of nonlinearity with the power input versus the output, meaning that the amount of power that you actually give the ball tends to not translate very well to what you're feeling, and it can make the ball accuracy a little bit more challenging for inexperienced players. So as this implies, with the 14mm variants, you still experience increased dwell even in comparison to a 16mm 3S. However, you also get the added benefit of linear power scale with power input to output, making your shot accuracy a little bit easier to control. So we're kind of dealing with two concepts that the vast majority of players might not have experienced before, which is a 14mm paddle not only being less powerful, but also easier to control than the 16mm counterpart. And I'll finish off this section talking about ball feel, which I think deserves the most emphasis out of anything. I believe if JOOLA was going for the plush feeling of a mod with the same power profile as a 3S, then I think they nailed it on the head. This is an area where I feel like the Pro 4s have separated themselves a little bit from the 3S. The 3Ss tend to feel a little bit more rigid and don't really tend to loosen up too much even throughout the break-in period, which I believe is due to UPA's stricter standards for PB core as well as ability to perform destructive testing. So the break-in comes with a lot more subtle changes that take a lot longer to feel, and we've seen other companies employ this same tactic. Overall, in terms of this ball feel, my mind immediately draws comparisons to the 11624 Huarache X power paddle. It really feels like the dwell time and the plushness of a floating core without actually having a floating core. And whereas in previous Perseus models, I felt like weighted tape is needed from the throat all the way up to a few inches on the sides to really improve the sweet spot forgiveness and bring down the balance point, I feel like a lot of players can get away with simply weighting in between the TFP and propulsion core foam area, which, to be fair, ironically, probably would have felt fine if this was a completely floating core. And lastly, overall, I do feel like there is a slight bit of nuance when it comes to sweet spot forgiveness versus plushness in this series. If you're looking for ultimate sweet spot forgiveness, you're probably going to go the Agassi Pro route over the Perseus shape simply due to the thicker neck area allowing for a wider sweet spot feel at the throat. However, if you're looking for ultimate plushness, there's really not a big difference between the two shapes, but the feeling is much more pronounced on the 16mm core thickness. So if you're looking for the best of both worlds, the Agassi Pro 16mm is probably more up your alley. All right, now let's get to the part that we are all wondering about, the durability testing. Let me tell you how everything shook out. The question was simple. How do I actually ensure that JOOLA is introducing higher durability paddles into the market? I started off with a simple power test. And no, I'm not just talking about the Pro 4. I went all the way back to the original Gen 3 and worked my way through all 4 iterations of the Perseus 16mm, the most popular paddle JOOLA has by far. Here were the initial power results after hitting the paddle stock. And you can see here how the 3S and the Pro 4 fall into a very similar category with a jump up to the original Gen 3 and an even higher jump up to the Mod TA15. The next part was a little bit more tricky. How do I actually simulate a prolonged period of playing time without going and hitting a bunch of serves, which would probably render my arm numb for at least 48 hours? So I did what any other rational person would do. I essentially set up my own rudimentary PB core test. For this, I was going to need my trusty Titan Ace ball machine, which, side note, link will be in the description for 10% off this machine. Of all the overpriced ball machines out there that really genuinely don't do that much, after trying out the Titan, it's the only one that I truly felt might actually be worth the sticker price due to the variety of its use cases. Back in the day, admittedly before I was on YouTube, Titan actually refused to send me one of these machines, either for demo nor reviewing. So I really feel confident in saying this because I truly had zero positive bias before trying it out. The rest of the process was fairly straightforward. I simply wove the handle of the paddles into a pickleball net and then began firing balls at 60 miles per hour from about 2 feet away onto the sweet spot of those paddles. And then I retested for power after 100, 250, and then 500 balls. Now, I'm fully aware that based on this setup, the term rudimentary PB core test might actually be incorrect and also a little bit overqualified for the real setup here. The balls are not coming onto the paddle at a straight angle. The handle is not being held at a natural hand pivot point. And of course, the most glaring issue, I'm not measuring deflection, I'm measuring power. So perhaps the term rudimentary destructive testing is a little bit better, but regardless, I did learn a lot about the durability of these paddles through this test. Here's a summary of the power results at all 4 checkpoints for the paddles. You can clearly see that the 3S and the Pro 4 not only start in a similar area, but also very minimally deviate from it. I also would say that there was no noticeable change in sound of the paddles nor feel as I was retesting the power. In my personal opinion, based on the data I've gathered, any difference in power between 0.3 and 0.5 miles per hour and up is significant enough to feel. So you can clearly see on the flip side with the Gen 3 original and the mods, these paddles have a very clear and pronounced break-in, and it is exponential. The mod did begin to sound a little bit more high-pitched and hollow around the 250 shot mark, whereas I experienced the same thing with the original Gen 3 closer to the 400 shot mark. I will also say after the 500 shot mark, in particular with the mods, I was hitting serve speeds at times at nearly 58.5 miles per hour. With the roll down velocity, a metric I discussed in my most recent podcast, as the speed with which the ball actually reaches the returner, being at over 25 miles per hour, meaning that nearly 40% of the ball energy was being conserved off the initial paddle strike. That is despite any top spin I put on that serve, and despite the 40 feet that the ball had to travel, including the air friction on a plastic ball with holes, which is absolutely insane and much, much higher than any other paddle I've tested. In summation, I don't believe it's a coincidence that the paddles with the non-compressed cores were experiencing very linear break-in, if you can even call it that, with very minimal difference in feel in comparison to the paddles with compressed cores. In my opinion, the compressed cores might be leading to a more inelastic collision with the ball that is allowing it to reach more dangerous speeds on the court. All right, let's wrap everything up by thinking about who should go out and buy this paddle. And it's easiest to start with who should not go and buy this paddle. If you're coming at this from a JOOLA loyalist perspective, you're not getting these paddles if you're a mod user expecting them to play exactly the same, as you'll be disappointed with the power level. You're also not getting these paddles if you're used to and comfortable with the 3S, as it has a very similar power profile, but you're going to get a very different experience from that rigid vibration dampening as well as head-heavy plow-through that you benefit from potentially on the 3S. In general, you're not getting these paddles if you want a truly muted vibration dampened experience like the Carbon True Foams, or you already have trouble keeping the ball in the court due to power, as a power paddle is only going to exacerbate those issues. It's also not for people that don't want to spend $280 on a paddle. The reality is there could always be a paddle out there at a lower value that does also fit your game just as well. It's going to take time and effort to research it, but it's possible with the thousands of paddles that are out there. Oh, and for the small niche of you that truly value spin above all else, there will be a UPA-only version of this paddle released in a few months that will have higher grit levels due to the UPA standards having higher tolerance, so I would hold off for that version. So thinking about who this paddle is for, again from a JOOLA loyalist perspective, you're looking at players that really enjoy the 3S, but want a more forgiving sweet spot, more plush dwell ball feel, as well as more maneuverability in the Perseus or Agassi Pro shape. It's also worth noting that the other shapes of this paddle are set to release in April. So if you have a very strong affinity for a paddle shape that is not the Perseus or the Agassi Pro, then definitely hold off for those. And for the rest of you, if the price tag isn't a deterrent, then you're essentially buying yourself into a paddle with all the positive characteristics that I just mentioned, but also backed by a company that is increasing their warranty from 6 months to 1 year. Now, it's not uncommon in the industry to have a 1-year warranty. However, I think it's interesting that based on my data, there's reason to suggest that JOOLA has actually solved some of their durability problems, and they are backing up that confidence with increasing that warranty on their end. All right, well, that's going to wrap up my thoughts here on the JOOLA Pro 4 and the Agassi Pro paddles. Now, I promised an opinion on which one I felt performed the best, and in my opinion, that is the Agassi Pro 14mm. Not only is having the more forgiving sweet spot towards the throat area something that I did feel and notice, but also having that linear translation of power input to power output, making it way easier to control my shots and make them more predictable compared to the 16mm, it emerged as my clear favorite. And with all that said, I hope you all enjoyed this video or at least learned something. Make sure you like, subscribe, and comment down below if you liked what you saw. I will provide an update on the Texas Open and how I fare with that Agassi Pro 14 in both singles and mixed doubles. But in the meantime, I hope you all stay happy and healthy, and of course, out on the courts. Until the next video. Peace.